You know what they say about Thailand. It's where middle-aged men go to find themselves. But sometimes they find something much darker instead. My friend Charles Dixon thought he was getting a fresh start in Pattaya. Instead, he walked straight into the most sophisticated trap I've ever witnessed. What happened to him over those 3 weeks will make you question everything you think you know about trust, manipulation, and how quickly a predator can destroy a life. By the time Charles realized what was happening, the photographs were already taken, the money was already gone, and his reputation hung by a thread thinner than spider silk. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe because the stories I share aren't just entertainment. They're warnings. Real warnings from real people who lived through nightmares you pray you'll never face. Charles Dixon was 53 when his world collapsed the first time. Not in Thailand. That came later. The first collapse happened in his pristine suburban home in Connecticut, where he'd built what he thought was an unshakable life. 26 years of marriage to Sarah. 2 kids who called every Sunday. A successful consulting firm that bore his name on glass doors. Then Sarah got sick. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't negotiate, doesn't give you time to prepare, doesn't care about your retirement plans or your silver anniversary trip to Europe. I watched Charles change during those final months. The man who once commanded boardrooms, who could read a client's intentions before they finished their sentence, became hollow-eyed and desperate. He spent every penny he had on experimental treatments, alternative therapies, anything that promised hope. When Sarah died on a rainy Tuesday in March, Charles wasn't just grieving. He was financially ruined. The medical bills had consumed their savings, forced him to mortgage the house twice, liquidate the business assets. 6 months after the funeral, Charles found himself in that strange purgatory of middle-aged loss. Too young to give up, too old to start completely over, too emotionally shattered to trust his own judgment. His daughter Emma suggested the trip. "Dad, you need to get away from all this. Somewhere completely different." She'd heard about digital nomads, about people reinventing themselves in Southeast Asia. "Maybe Thailand," she said, researching on her laptop. "It's beautiful, it's affordable, and you can figure out what comes next." Charles wasn't looking for adventure when he boarded that flight to Bangkok. He was looking for invisibility, for a place where nobody knew his story, where he could exist without the weight of condolences and concerned looks. Pattaya seemed perfect. A coastal city where Western retirees blended into the background, where a man could sit by the ocean and think about his next move without anyone asking questions. He rented a modest apartment near the beach. Nothing fancy, but clean and quiet. For the first 2 weeks, Charles did exactly what he'd hoped. He disappeared. Morning coffee at the same cafe. Long walks along the shore. Afternoons reading in air-conditioned silence. He was healing, slowly, the way a broken bone heals when you finally stop moving it. That's when Nitaya entered his story. I met Charles in a cocktail lounge called The Sanctuary, one of those upscale places that cater to expats who want to feel sophisticated while drinking overpriced whiskey. It was his 3rd week in Pattaya, and he'd finally worked up the courage to venture out after dark. I was there on business. My company has operations throughout Southeast Asia, and I'd flown in from Singapore for meetings. Charles was sitting alone at the bar, nursing a bourbon and staring out at the street lights reflecting off the rain-soaked pavement. We struck up a conversation the way men do in foreign countries, cautiously at first, then with growing relief at finding someone who spoke the same cultural language. Charles told me about Sarah, about losing everything, about trying to figure out how to rebuild at his age. I told him about my own expatriate journey, the challenges and unexpected discoveries of starting over in Asia. We talked until last call, and I genuinely liked the guy. He was intelligent, decent, carrying his grief with dignity. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," he said as we were settling our tabs. "Her name is Nitya. She works here sometimes. Not as a server. She's in management or something. Really interesting woman. She's been incredibly kind to me since I started coming here." I should have paid more attention to the way his voice changed when he said her name. Not quite infatuation, but something deeper. Gratitude mixed with something that sounded almost like dependence. Nitya appeared as if summoned, gliding across the lounge with the kind of grace that makes men forget their own names. She was maybe 35, stunningly beautiful in that effortless way that some Asian women possess, wearing a black dress that was conservative yet somehow magnetic. When Charles introduced us, she smiled with perfect white teeth and shook my hand with just the right amount of pressure. Confident, but not aggressive. Warm, but not presumptuous. "Charles has told me so much about his friend from Singapore," she said, her English accented but flawless. "I'm so glad to finally meet you. Charles is very special to us here. We take good care of our special guests." The way she said special made me study her more carefully. There was something practiced about her warmth, like she'd perfected the art of making men feel unique, while saying exactly the same words to a dozen others. But Charles was beaming beside her, and I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I'd spent too many years in business, analyzing everyone's motives, looking for hidden agendas. Nitya joined us for a drink, and I watched the dynamic between them. She listened to Charles with total attention, asked thoughtful questions about his life in America, expressed genuine seeming sympathy about his losses. When he excused himself to use the restroom, she leaned closer to me. "He's been through so much," she said, her voice soft with concern. "I worry about him. He seems so lost, so alone. I try to make sure he knows he has friends here, people who care about him." Pause the video for a moment and tell me in the comments, what strikes you as suspicious about this situation so far? What would you do if you were Charles's friend in this moment? When Charles returned, Nitya's attention shifted back to him seamlessly. She remembered details from conversations they'd apparently had before. His daughter's wedding next year, his concerns about his financial situation, his uncertainty about the future. She was building something with him, thread by thread, and I could see him getting more comfortable, more open, with each exchange. "Charles, I have an idea," she said as the evening wound down. "Tomorrow is Saturday. Why don't you come to the night market with me? I need to shop for my apartment, and you could help me practice my English. Then maybe dinner at a place only locals know about. Much better than the tourist restaurants." Charles agreed immediately, and I watched something shift in his posture. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely excited about something. The prospect of having plans, of being needed, even in such a small way, seemed to energize him. After Nitya left, Charles and I shared one more drink. "She's amazing, isn't she?" he said. "I never expected to meet someone like her here. She makes me feel like maybe I can start over, you know? Like maybe there's still something good waiting for me." I nodded and smiled, but something cold was settling in my stomach. Maybe it was the businessman in me, trained to spot deals that seemed too good to be true. Maybe it was just intuition. But as I watched Charles's face light up talking about Nitya, I couldn't shake the feeling that my friend was walking into something dangerous. The next 3 weeks unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance, and I had a front row seat to Charles's transformation. My business in Pattaya stretched longer than expected, giving me the chance to observe what was happening to my new friend. At first, I was genuinely happy for him. The night market date apparently went wonderfully. Charles returned to his apartment with bags of street food and stories about hidden temples Nitaya had shown him. Local customs she'd explained. Jokes they'd shared despite the language barrier. "She's not like anyone I've ever met," Charles told me over coffee the next morning. "She sees things differently. She has this way of finding beauty in small moments, you know? Yesterday we spent an hour just watching fishermen mend their nets. And she told me stories about each boat, each family. It was like seeing the world through completely new eyes." Nitaya began appearing in Charles's life with increasing frequency, casual encounters at first, running into him at the market, suggesting better places to buy fruit, offering to translate when he had trouble with his landlord. But soon, she was texting him daily, inviting him to cultural events, introducing him to her friends. Charles blossomed under the attention. The hollow-eyed grief I'd first seen in him began filling with something that looked like hope. But I noticed other things too. How Nitaya always seemed to know exactly where Charles would be, even when he hadn't told her his plans. How their conversations often drifted toward his financial situation. Not directly, but through concerned questions about his future. Gentle suggestions about investment opportunities in Thailand. Casual mentions of friends who'd made smart business moves. How she had a remarkable ability to make Charles feel like he was taking care of her, while she was actually managing every aspect of their interaction. The red flags became harder to ignore during the second week. Charles started changing his routines to accommodate Nitaya's schedule. He'd cancel our planned dinners because she needed help with something. Translating documents, meeting her family, dealing with some bureaucratic issue that required a Western man's presence. Each time, Charles apologized profusely, but couldn't hide his excitement about being needed. "She's had such a hard life," he confided in me one evening. "Her family lost everything during the financial crisis. She's been working so hard to support them, but it's never enough. She's too proud to ask for help directly, but I can see the stress wearing on her." I asked careful questions. What kind of work did she do exactly? How had they met so coincidentally that first night? Why did someone with her apparent education and sophistication need so much help with English? Charles's answers were vague, full of explanations that explained nothing. He was falling, and falling hard, for someone I was increasingly certain wasn't who she claimed to be. The financial requests started small and seemed completely reasonable. Nitaya's motorbike broke down. Just $200 for repairs, which she promised to pay back from her next paycheck. Her mother needed medicine. $500, and again, she had the money coming next week. Charles gave freely, almost eagerly. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt useful, needed, important to someone. "I know what you're thinking," he said when I gently suggested he might want to slow things down. "I'm not some naive tourist throwing money at a bar girl. Nitaya is educated, sophisticated. She works in hospitality management. She has a degree from Bangkok University. This isn't what you think it is." But Charles was changing in ways that worried me. He'd started drinking more, sleeping less, obsessing over every text message from Nitya. When she didn't respond quickly, he'd spiral into anxiety. When she cancelled plans, he'd spend hours analyzing what he might have done wrong. The confident businessman I'd met that first night was being replaced by someone desperate and increasingly dependent. The breaking point came during week 3. Nitaya had invited Charles to a weekend getaway, a resort in the mountains where they could deepen their connection away from the distractions of Pattaya. Charles was over the moon about the invitation, seeing it as confirmation that their relationship was moving to the next level. He'd bought new clothes, planned romantic gestures, talked about the trip for days in advance. I didn't hear from Charles for 3 days after they left. When he finally called, his voice was different, strained, confused, almost broken. "I need to see you," he said. Something happened. I don't know what to do. We met at a different bar, one far from the sanctuary. Charles looked like he'd aged a decade in 72 hours. His hands shook as he ordered whiskey after whiskey, and it took him an hour to get the story out. The resort weekend had started perfectly. Beautiful location, romantic dinners, long conversations about their future together. But on the final night, things got blurry. Charles remembered dinner, remembered wine, remembered Nitaya suggesting they continue the celebration in their room. After that, everything went black. He woke up alone, fully clothed on top of the bed covers, with the worst hangover of his life and no memory of the previous 8 hours. Nitaya was gone, along with her luggage. The resort staff said she checked out early, left a message that she had a family emergency. Charles tried calling her dozens of times. Her phone went straight to voicemail. For 2 days, Charles convinced himself there was an explanation. Family crisis, lost phone, some misunderstanding that would clear up as soon as she could contact him. He was worried about Nitaya, not suspicious. Even as I listened to his story, I could see him making excuses, creating innocent explanations for what was obviously a setup. The photographs arrived by email the next morning. You know, if you're enjoying these stories about real people facing extraordinary situations, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and tell me in the comments. Have you or anyone you know ever experienced something similar? These scams are more common than people realize, and sharing experiences might help someone avoid a similar trap. The email came from an anonymous account with a subject line that made Charles's blood freeze. Interesting evening at the resort. Inside were dozens of high-resolution photographs that told a story Charles couldn't remember living. Images of him in bed with Nitaya, both of them naked, in positions that looked intimate and consensual. Photos of him apparently passed out while she posed next to him. Pictures that would destroy his reputation, devastate his daughter, make him unemployable in his conservative industry back home. But the most disturbing part wasn't the photographs themselves. It was how staged they looked. Charles studied every image obsessively, and the more he analyzed them, the more obvious it became that he'd been unconscious for most or all of the photography session. His eyes were closed or unfocused in every shot. His body positioning looked lifeless, manipulated. The few images where his eyes appeared open had a glassy, drugged quality that was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Nitaya, meanwhile, looked perfectly alert and in control. She was performing for the camera, creating what appeared to be a passionate encounter with an unconscious man. The professional quality of the lighting and composition suggested this wasn't someone's phone camera. This was a planned photo shoot with proper equipment. The blackmail demand came 3 hours later from the same anonymous email address. $50,000 transferred to a cryptocurrency wallet, or the photographs would be sent to Charles's daughter, his former business partners, his social media contacts, and posted on revenge porn websites with his full name attached. The email included screenshots proving they already had access to his Facebook friends list, his LinkedIn connections, even his daughter's work email address. Pay the $50,000 and this ends. The message concluded. Refuse, and your new life in Thailand becomes impossible, and your old life in America becomes a public humiliation. You have 48 hours. Charles was shattered. The betrayal cut deeper than the blackmail itself. He'd opened his heart to Nitaya, shared his grief about Sarah, his dreams about starting over, his fears about aging alone. She'd listened with apparent compassion, made him feel understood and valued, then used every piece of emotional intelligence she'd gathered to destroy him more completely. I fell in love with her, Charles told me, tears streaming down his face. I actually thought she cared about me. God, I'm such an idiot. Sarah would be so disappointed in me. The psychological manipulation was masterful in its cruelty. Nitaya hadn't just robbed Charles. She'd made him complicit in his own destruction by making him care about her first. The photographs weren't just blackmail material. They were a violation of his trust, his dignity, his sense of reality. How do you recover from discovering that weeks of your life, feelings you thought were real, experiences you cherished, were all part of an elaborate deception? Charles wanted to pay immediately. $50,000 would wipe out what remained of his savings. But he couldn't bear the thought of his daughter seeing those photographs. Emma was getting married in 6 months. How could he explain this to her? How could he face her knowing that somewhere on the internet, images existed that would shatter her faith in her father's judgment? But I convinced him to wait, not because I thought the blackmailers would go away. People like this never stop at just one payment. I convinced him to wait because I recognized the level of sophistication in this operation. And I suspected Charles wasn't their first victim. We spent the next day doing research. Internet searches revealed dozens of similar stories. Western men, usually middle-aged and recently divorced or widowed, targeted by attractive women in Thailand who used the same basic playbook. Emotional manipulation, false intimacy, drugging, staged photographs, cryptocurrency demands. The Thai police were familiar with the pattern, but rarely able to prosecute because the criminal networks were international, technically sophisticated, and constantly evolving. Charles wasn't just a victim. He was a mark in an industrial-scale operation that had probably processed hundreds of men like him. The realization was somehow both devastating and liberating. Devastating, because it meant everything with Nitya had been fake from the very first smile. Liberating, because it meant Charles wasn't uniquely foolish or naive. He'd been targeted by professionals who studied men like him for a living. The more we learned, the angrier I became on Charles's behalf. These weren't opportunistic criminals. They were psychological predators who specialized in exploiting grief, loneliness, and the universal need for human connection. They'd probably been watching Charles for days before that first accidental meeting at the sanctuary, learning his routines, his vulnerabilities, his emotional triggers. With 36 hours left before the blackmail deadline, Charles made a decision that surprised me. Instead of paying the $50,000, he chose to fight back. The decision to resist came after Charles spent a sleepless night staring at the photographs, analyzing every detail with the methodical precision that had made him successful in business. The more he studied the images, the more obvious their staged nature became. The professional lighting, the careful camera angles, the way Nitya was positioned to look passionate while he looked unconscious. This wasn't blackmail born from a relationship gone wrong. This was a criminal enterprise. And Charles finally understood. He was just their latest victim. "I won't let them win," he told me the next morning, his voice steady for the first time in days. "If I pay them, they'll just demand more money next month, then more after that. And meanwhile, they're doing this to other men, other families. Someone has to stop them." Charles's background in business consulting proved invaluable. He approached the situation like a complex corporate problem, gathering intelligence, analyzing weaknesses, developing strategy. We reached out to other victims through online forums, expat communities, and local police connections. The pattern was always the same: attractive women, sophisticated emotional manipulation, drugged encounters, professional photography, cryptocurrency blackmail. But Charles discovered something the criminals probably didn't expect him to find. Several previous victims had kept detailed records of their experiences. including phone numbers, social media profiles, meeting locations, even surveillance footage from hotels and restaurants. When you compiled all this information together, a clear picture emerged of a network that was large, organized, but not as careful about operational security as they thought. Nitaya, it turned out, wasn't even her real name. She was part of a group that operated throughout Southeast Asia, with established relationships with corrupt hotel staff, professional photographers, money launderers, and tech specialists who handled the digital aspects of their crimes. They'd been successful for years because most victims were too embarrassed to report the crimes, too isolated to compare notes with other victims, too desperate to avoid exposure to fight back effectively. Charles spent $20,000 of his remaining savings on a private investigator with connections in Thai law enforcement, not to recover his losses. That money was certainly gone forever, but to gather enough evidence to make prosecution possible. The investigator, a former Bangkok police detective named Somchai, was initially skeptical about the case's chances. "These groups are very sophisticated," Somchai warned. "They use multiple identities, cryptocurrency wallets that can't be traced, servers located in different countries. Even if we identify the individuals involved, prosecution is very difficult because the evidence crosses so many jurisdictions." But Charles had documentation that previous victims lacked. His business training had led him to keep detailed records of every interaction with Nitaya, screenshots of text messages, receipts from restaurants and activities, even a timeline of their relationship that revealed patterns the criminals used repeatedly. More importantly, Charles had something most victims didn't: the resources and determination to see the case through regardless of personal cost. The breakthrough came when Somchai's contacts in the tourist police identified the resort where Charles had been drugged. Security footage showed Nitya arriving with Charles, but also revealed her meeting with a man who wasn't registered at the hotel, someone who appeared to be carrying camera equipment. The hotel staff, when pressed by police, admitted they'd been paid to look the other way during certain private parties involving Western guests. Within 2 weeks, the investigation had identified 12 members of the criminal network, including the photographers, the money launderers, and the technical team that handled the blackmail communications. Nitya, whose real name was Ploy Chanticha, was arrested at a luxury condo in Bangkok, along with her partner, a British expatriate named David Morrison, who turned out to be the mastermind behind the entire operation. Morrison had been running variations of this scam for 8 years, specifically targeting recently divorced or widowed Western men, because they were emotionally vulnerable and often had substantial divorce settlements or insurance payouts to steal. The network had processed more than 300 victims and stolen an estimated $12 million before Charles's case broke them open. The arrests made international news, which created an unexpected problem for Charles. While he'd succeeded in stopping the criminals, fighting back had made his story public in ways that paying the blackmail wouldn't have. His name appeared in newspaper articles about the case. His photograph ran alongside stories about romance scams in Thailand. Emma found out about everything when concerned friends started sending her links to news articles about her father's case. But Charles discovered something remarkable about truth-telling. Even when the truth is embarrassing and painful, Emma's reaction wasn't disappointment or judgment. It was fierce pride in her father's courage and determination to protect other people from the same victimization. "Dad, what you did took incredible strength," she told him during a long phone call after the arrests. "You could have just paid them and tried to forget it happened. Instead, You fought back and saved other families from going through what we've been through. Mom would have been so proud of you. The legal process dragged on for months, but eventually, Morrison received 8 years in Thai prison, and Ploy received 5 years. More importantly, their financial assets were frozen, and several victims received partial restitution from seized cryptocurrency accounts. Charles recovered about 30% of what he'd lost, enough to stabilize his situation while he figured out his next steps. But the most significant change wasn't financial. It was psychological. Fighting back against the blackmailers had restored Charles's sense of agency and self-respect in ways that simply paying them never could have. He transformed from victim to advocate, from mark to investigator, from someone who'd been manipulated into someone who'd helped dismantle a criminal enterprise. Charles stayed in Thailand for another 6 months. Not because he was running away from his problems, but because he'd found a new purpose. He began working with tourist police and embassy officials to educate other expatriates about romance scams. He helped develop educational materials for newly arrived Western men, warning them about the psychological techniques these criminal networks use to identify and exploit vulnerable targets. "I can't undo what happened to me," Charles told a group of expatriates during one of his talks, "but I can help make sure it doesn't happen to you. These criminals are sophisticated, but they're not invincible. They count on shame and isolation to protect them. When we share information, when we support each other, when we refuse to let embarrassment silence us, they lose their power." The experience had changed Charles in fundamental ways. The confident businessman I'd met that first night at the sanctuary was gone, replaced by someone more cautious, but also more compassionate. He'd learned to recognize the difference between genuine connection and skilled manipulation. He'd discovered reservoirs of strength he didn't know he possessed. Most importantly, he'd found meaning in his suffering by using it to protect others. When Charles finally returned to Connecticut, he wasn't the same broken man who'd fled there after Sarah's death. He'd been tested in ways he never imagined possible and had chosen courage over comfort, truth over convenience, community over isolation. Emma noticed the change immediately when she picked him up at the airport. "You look different, Dad," she said, as they drove home through familiar suburban streets. "Stronger somehow, like you've been through something terrible, but came out the other side." Charles had indeed come through something terrible, but he'd emerged with gifts he hadn't expected. A deeper understanding of his own resilience, a clearer sense of what mattered in his remaining years, a network of friends and fellow survivors who understood what he'd experienced in ways that people who hadn't been targeted never could. 6 months after returning home, Charles received an unexpected email, not from blackmailers this time, but from a woman named Jennifer, a widow from his hometown who'd read about his case in the local newspaper. She wasn't interested in romance. She was starting a non-profit organization to help victims of international fraud and wanted Charles's help developing educational programs. "I know this might sound strange," Jennifer wrote, "but I was wondering if you'd like to get coffee sometime and talk about your experiences. Not because I'm interested in you personally, though you seem like a decent man, but because I think we might be able to do some good work together." Charles found himself laughing as he read the email. The directness, the clear boundaries, the focus on shared work rather than personal connection. It was everything his relationship with Nitya hadn't been. Honest, transparent, mutually beneficial without being manipulative. They met at a coffee shop near Charles's old office building, the same place where he used to meet clients back when his life seemed simpler and more predictable. Jennifer was smart, funny, and refreshingly straightforward about her own experiences with loss and recovery. She'd lost her husband to a heart attack 3 years earlier and had spent the intervening time building a new life focused on helping other people navigate sudden transitions. "I'm not looking for a relationship," she told Charles over their second cup of coffee. "I've got too much work to do, and I'm finally at peace with being alone. But I could use a partner in this fraud prevention work, someone who understands the psychology of victimization from the inside." Charles agreed immediately. Working with Jennifer felt completely different from his interactions with Nitaya. Collaborative instead of manipulative, energizing instead of draining, focused on building something meaningful instead of extracting something valuable. Over the following months, they developed educational seminars, wrote articles for retirement magazines, and consulted with law enforcement agencies about international fraud prevention. Their work together evolved slowly into something deeper, but it was built on transparency and mutual respect rather than desperate need and skilled deception. When Charles finally asked Jennifer to dinner, a real dinner, not a working meeting, she laughed and said she'd been wondering when he'd work up the courage. "I've been interested in you for weeks," she admitted, "but I wanted to make sure you were interested in me, not just in having someone to cure your loneliness. There's a difference, you know?" Charles knew exactly what she meant. He'd learned the difference the hard way. In a hotel room in Thailand, where he'd woken up alone with photographs that documented his unconscious violation. The relationship that grew between Charles and Jennifer was built on the foundation of that hard-earned wisdom. The understanding that genuine intimacy requires vulnerability, honesty, and mutual respect, not skilled manipulation of emotional needs. 2 years after returning from Thailand, Charles and Jennifer were married in a small ceremony attended by Emma, Jennifer's children, and several of the fraud victims Charles had helped through their non-profit work. It wasn't the fairy tale second chance romance that movies promise to widowed people. It was something better. A partnership between equals who'd both learn to recognize the difference between love and exploitation. Charles never forgot what happened to him in Thailand, but he stopped being defined by it. The shame and humiliation that had initially overwhelmed him transformed into expertise and advocacy. The vulnerability that had made him a target became strength that helped other people avoid similar traps. The isolation that had made him desperate for connection became the foundation for building genuine community with other survivors. The last time I saw Charles, he was speaking at a conference about international fraud prevention. He told his story with the same methodical precision he'd once brought to business consulting, but with an emotional honesty that made his presentation unforgettable. He didn't minimize what had happened to him or pretend it had been easy to overcome. He acknowledged the ongoing work required to trust his own judgment again, to open his heart to genuine relationships after experiencing such skilled deception. "I thought I was looking for a new life in Thailand," Charles told the audience. "Instead, I found the worst experience of my life. And through that experience, I found my actual new life. I learned that resilience isn't about avoiding difficult situations. It's about what you choose to do when difficult situations find you. I learned that shame loses its power when you share it with people who understand. Most importantly, I learned that even the worst experiences can become sources of strength if you're willing to transform them into service to others." The story doesn't end with Charles and Jennifer living happily ever after, because real life doesn't work that way. They have challenges, disagreements, difficult days when Charles still struggles with trust, or Jennifer worries about losing someone she loves again. But they face those challenges together, as partners who chose each other with full knowledge of each other's histories and full commitment to building something honest and sustainable. Charles's experience in Thailand taught him that predators exist, that skilled manipulators can exploit even intelligent, careful people, that loneliness and grief create vulnerabilities that criminals understand better than their victims do. But it also taught him that resilience is possible, that fighting back against injustice creates meaning from suffering, that community with fellow survivors can transform shame into strength. If you're watching this and thinking about someone in your life who might be vulnerable to these kinds of scams, a recently divorced friend, a widowed parent, anyone who's going through a major life transition, don't wait for them to ask for help. Share this story with them. Talk about the warning signs. Help them understand that these criminal networks specifically target people during vulnerable transitions, and that falling for their sophisticated manipulation doesn't reflect poorly on someone's intelligence or judgment. And if you're someone who's experienced something similar to what Charles went through, know that you're not alone, you're not stupid, and you're not powerless. These criminals are professionals who study human psychology specifically to exploit normal human needs for connection and meaning. Recovery is possible, justice is sometimes achievable, and the strength you develop from surviving sophisticated victimization can become a gift you give to other people facing similar challenges. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories about real people facing extraordinary situations with courage and intelligence. Leave a comment telling me what struck you most about Charles's story, or share your own experiences with international scams if you're comfortable doing so. These conversations matter because they break the isolation that these criminals count on to protect themselves. When we share information, support each other, and refuse to let shame silence us, we make it harder for predators to find new victims and easier for survivors to find their way back to trust and connection. Your story matters, your experience has value, and your willingness to learn from difficult situations can help protect other people from similar harm. That's how we transform individual suffering into collective strength, and how we make sure that the Charles Dixons of the world don't have to face these challenges alone.